Chapter 17, The Last Venture. The total number of Red troops on the southern front was something like 55 to 60,000 bayonets and 22 to 25,000 sabers, counting only combatants. The complete figure, including formations behind the lines, reached 600,000 men. The proportion of the Red troops to the Russian army was at least 3 or 3.5 to 1. The Red Command's plan of campaign provided for the application of pincers to the living force of the Russian army and a sudden eruption into the Crimea by way of the isthmuses. I forestalled the Red Command's plans, and collecting an attacking force, I launched an operation consisting of consecutive attacks at the enemy's main body. My attacking force maneuvered on the operative lines in the interior. When I reached the front, General Kutupov's and General Abramov's units were fighting for the third day in succession. The weather was colder than ever. There had not been such a frost in the Crimea for dozens of years. The number of its victims increased daily. The men muffled themselves up in any clothes that came to hand. Some of them swathed themselves in straw underneath their shirts. In spite of the real gallantry of our troops, the infantry of the 1st Army Corps was driven back from the banks of the Dnieper, and the enemy set foot on the left bank and began to push southwards. On October 15th, the units of the 2nd Army Corps had also been driven back by the enemy's troops, which emerged from the armed camp at Kakhovka. We had been expecting the principal attack to come from this direction. In the course of the morning of October 16th, the temperature fell to 14 degrees below zero. A thick fog enveloped us. Nothing could be distinguished a few steps ahead. In the evening, a dispatch arrived from the 2nd Army Corps. Hard pressed by the enemy, the units were retreating to Perekop. Large masses of Red cavalry had turned the right wing of the 2nd Army Corps and were advancing rapidly towards the east. The 1st Red Cavalry Army had thrown all its forces behind our troops and was striving to cut off their retreat into the Crimea. In the meanwhile, General Kutupov was marking time. I sent him a wireless order to march on Salkovo with all speed and do his utmost to check the enemy troops which had penetrated our lines at Savach. All the same, it was clear that the enemy would reach the isthmuses before General Kutupov's troops could arrive. The enemy were on the march and were not meeting a single obstacle. They could be expected at Salkovo on the evening of the 17th. The fortified positions which guarded the approaches to the Crimea were garrisoned only with very small lookout patrols. The Red troops could easily seize the Salkovo Pass at one bound and cut off all communications between our army and the Crimea. It was absolutely urgent that we should occupy the Salkovo Pass. During the night of the 16th, I ordered General Abramov to send the infantry division, which was concentrated at Melitopol, to Salkovo under cover of armored cars. But the railroad was blocked, and the movement was earned out very slowly. The temperature fell to 20 degrees below zero. The water froze in the pumps at the stations, for they were not constructed to stand such intense cold. The echelons were held up on the march. 1 hour of anguish succeeded another. I had no troops at my command. The entrance to the Crimea was open to the enemy. During the day of the 17th, I sent everyone who could bear arms to Salkovo, the Simferopol Military School, the Artillery School, and my own escort. I sent to Feodosia for General Fostikov's Kubanian units, even though he had not yet had time to reorganize them. At twilight, the Red Cavalry units came up to Salkovo and discharged a fusillade at our meager units. At nightfall, the Red Cavalry dismounted and attempted an attack on foot, but were repulsed by our rifle and artillery fire. During the night, I managed to establish wireless communications with General Kutupov. I ordered him to quicken his movements as much as possible, get into touch with the units of the 2nd Army, which was retreating along the line of the railway, take the command into his own hands, strike at the enemy in the north, and try to check them at Savach. On the morning of the 18th, General Abramov's units came up from Rikovo Station and came to grips with the enemy. Towards midday, General Kutupov's units came up from the west. The position of Comrade Budeni's cavalry could have become very serious, for it had been driven back from the northeast and the north onto the semi-frozen salt marshes of Savach. General Abramov's infantry units threw themselves with all their strength upon the enemy, who were not expecting an attack from this side. Boudinot's cavalry were taken unawares, whilst the regiments were resting in the villages and the horses were unsaddled. The Red cavalry dashed about in utter disorder. The squadrons formed up hastily and rushed about in all directions, passing between our infantry units. One of the enemy's batteries, with all its equipment and a great deal of transport, fell into the hands of General Guselchnikov's Cossacks. The way into the Crimea was still open to our troops. If General Kutupov had acted more energetically, the fine flower of the Red cavalry, comrade Boudinot's army, would have suffered the fate of Jloba's cavalry. But the successful beginning of this offensive bore almost no fruit. Our troops had no base. They were surrounded on all sides by the enemy and were still shaken by the hardships they had endured. As a result, they fought but spiritlessly. The officers themselves no longer manifested their former bold assurance. The main body of the Red cavalry was able to file off eastwards without hindrance and outstrip General Kutupov's cavalry. On October 20th, General Abramov's troops were fighting in the pass. Later on, General Kutupov's units came up, closely followed by the Red cavalry. The decisive battle in northern Taurida was over. The enemy had become master of all the territory we had taken from them during the summer. An enormous amount of booty had fallen into their hands. 5 armored trains, 18 guns, nearly 100 wagon loads of shells, 10 million cartridges, 25 locomotive engines, several trains loaded with provisions and ammunition, and nearly 2 million poods of corn from Melitopol and Gwenichesk. Our troops had suffered heavy losses. Many had been killed, wounded, or frozen. A large number of prisoners and stragglers were in the hands of the enemy. The stragglers were mostly the soldiers of the Red Army whom we had incorporated into our units at different times. There were several cases of wholesale surrender. A whole battalion in Drozdovsky's division gave itself up. But the army as a whole was still intact, and our troops in their turn had taken 15 big guns, nearly 2,000 prisoners, and many rifles and machine guns. The army was intact, but its fighting power was no longer what it had been. Could this army rely on our fortifications for support and withstand the enemy's attacks? 6 months' intensive work had resulted in the erection of fortifications which made it very difficult for the enemy to enter the Crimea. Trenches had been dug, barrages of barbed wire erected, heavy artillery emplaced, and machine gun posts constructed. All the technical equipment in the fortress of Sebastopol had been put in use. The branch railway, which had been extended to Yuchun, made it possible for our armored trains to keep the approaches to the fortifications under fire. The armor plating, the dugouts, and the huts for the troops were the only things still unfinished. Lack of manual labor and wood had delayed the work. The intense cold, which had set in exceptionally early, had given rise to a particularly unfortunate situation because our line of defense lay along a practically uninhabited area, so that the question of billets for the troops became extremely acute. In the very first days after Poland had signed the peace, when I had first decided to risk a battle in northern Taurida, I had foreseen the possibility of an unfavorable issue and had visualized the probability of the victorious enemy invading the Crimea on the heels of our troops. However strong a position may be, it is bound to fall if the spirit of the troops who are defending it is broken. Therefore, I had at the time ordered General Chatelov to verify the plan of evacuation which the General Staff had drawn up in cooperation with the Admiral of the fleet. This plan had provided for the evacuation of 60,000 men. I had ordered the figure to be altered to 75,000 men and had directed that the coal and oil needed to complete our reserve supplies of fuel should be delivered immediately from Constantinople. As soon as our retreat into the Crimea seemed inevitable, I had ordered ships to be prepared immediately in the ports of Kerch, Feodosia, and Yalta to embark 13,000 men and 4,000 horses. I had explained away this measure as a preparation for a raid on Odessa, the object of which was to join the Russian troops operating in the Ukraine. To mask my real intentions even more completely, I did everything to substantiate the rumors that a raid was to be made. The General Staff was ordered to spread the rumor that a landing in Kuban was being planned. The number of troops to be mentioned was chosen in proportion to our effective forces in such a way that even those who knew the exact number of our troops could not be suspicious. I ordered the ships to be loaded with provisions and ammunition. Having in this way secured a certain quantity of free tonnage in the port of Sebastopol, I could, in case of misfortune, very quickly embark 40 to 50,000 men in the principal ports, Sebastopol, Yalta, Feodasia, and Kerch, and under cover of the retreating troops save the women, children, wounded, and sick entrusted to my care. On the evening of the 20th, General Kutupov came to see me. Although he was outwardly calm, his words betrayed his anxiety. Amongst other things, he asked me if I had prepared for a possible misfortune. My answer obviously reassured him. On the 21st, General Abramov arrived. I consulted the two army commanders, and on the 22nd, I issued an order to the troops entrusting the defense of the Crimea to General Kutupov and amalgamating the command, putting it entirely into his hands. During the night of the 22nd, I left for Sebastopol. The slightest panic behind the lines would spread to the troops. This had to be avoided at all costs. Immediately I arrived, I summoned the press agents and gave them a general explanation of the situation. On the evening of the 22nd, there was a sitting of the South Russian government I presided. I gave a detailed report of the recent fighting and pointed out the difficulty of our troops' situation owing to the enormous numerical superiority of the enemy. I dwelt upon the particular difficulties of the troops and the population in the besieged Crimea and the intensive work which would be necessary on our part. At the same time, I assured them that we would defend the last scrap of native soil and that once we were rested, re-equipped, and reinforced, we would attempt to wrest victory from the hands of the enemy. My timely measures had lulled the anxiety which had been aroused. All was quiet behind the lines, for everyone believed the Perekop lines to be impregnable. On October 26th, a conference of representatives from the towns met at Simferopol and adopted a resolution approving the policy of the South Russian government and promising it wholehearted support. A press congress was to meet in Sebastopol on October 30th. Life was going on as usual. The shops were crowded with customers, the theaters and cinemas were packed. On October 25th, one of our military societies organized a musical evening in aid of some charity. I accepted an invitation to attend it, burying my desperate anguish deep in my breast, for I thought that my absence from such a party, organized as it was by a regimental society on whose books I figured, would give rise to panicky comments. I remained at the concert until 11 o'clock, listening to the music without hearing it, and making a great effort to say a friendly word to a wounded officer or pay a compliment to one of the ladies who had organized the affair. Our troops had completed their regrouping. The intense cold had frozen over the salt marshes of Savash, and our line of defense was therefore considerably lengthened. The lack of housing accommodation and of fuel increased the number of victims of the cold. I ordered all the reserve supplies of clothing that could be found in our depots to be distributed amongst the troops. At this moment, the large transport ship Ryan arrived with winter clothing for the troops, but it was too late.